Why is hot weather running so stinking hard, and what can you do to make it easier for yourself? Hello there, my friends. Welcome back to the Messy Middle Podcast / the Dockless Fitness YouTube. Today I want to talk about hot weather running or hot weather exercise in general, why it's hard, what's happening physiologically, and what you can do to kind of work with it and not against it during this time of the year. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast platform or watching this on YouTube, if you can, rate, review, like, subscribe, comment, all the things. It helps support me and the show and my content so I can keep providing you with free educational resources to help you and your training goals here on across all of my platforms. So on that note, let's dive in. Hot weather is around the corner if you're in the northern hemisphere and or you are right in the middle of it, sitting there in heat and or humidity, and you can feel like your running or cardio or training goals have gone right down the drain with this heat. So let's talk about heat and humidity a little bit and understand what's going on in our body. So essentially, when you are exercising in heat and or humidity, your body has to both work against its internal core temperature, where it's going to be bringing heat that you're producing in your muscle tissues from your core outward to your extremities and release that heat into your environment. Now, when you have a hotter environment, it's going to be harder because you're also going to have your personal temperature elevated from the heat of your environment. But this is even double whammied if you're training in heat and humidity, where when that heat is trying to dissipate into your environment, the humidity and the moisture in the air or the compound of that with the moisture in your skin is making it hard to release that heat. So you're almost kind of holding it in a little bit more into your body and system. This is why East Coast or more humid people, in the US have a harder time with that heat and humidity, because the combo of that together increases the difficulty of your body to essentially cool itself. So the only thing that you can do in order to cool yourself is slow down or use mechanisms to cool yourself specifically within that. And so this isn't just unique to humidity. This is also heat as well. Training in heat is hard, whether it's hot or wet or dry or wet. But we can think about doing a few things to help combat what happens to ourselves physiologically. Not only is your body having a hard time dissipating heat, it's also losing a lot of sweat. And if you are in the humid environments as well, you are going to have a higher sweat rate because your body is going to be trying to cool itself against the humidity, and you kind of have this double whammy of your body not being able to cool itself against its environment. And or if you're in a more arid or dry environment, the sun or the environment might be evaporating your sweat off you, and you might not be noticing quite how much you are sweating during this process. So some of us are running through wet socks, soup season, armpit of weather, where the rest of us are in this very dry but very hot heat. And so when this happens, when you start sweating, you start losing blood plasma. So plasma is like the watery component of the blood in your body, and your blood itself is responsible for delivering the oxygen you're breathing in through your bloodstream into your muscles and delivering it so you can produce energy to keep moving you forward. And so when you have this plasma component of your blood volume start to decrease or lessen, your heart has to work harder to deliver the same amount of blood to your body, to deliver it to your muscle tissues, to bring oxygen to fuel and supply the activity that you're doing. So not only are you having a hard time cooling yourself, but your body is also then increasing its heart rate because it's losing that watery component of your blood, and it's starting to have to work harder to produce the same amount of oxygen and energy supply that your body was doing in a cooler or less humid environment. So what this essentially means is that typically you have a higher exercising heart rate, or you have something known as cardiac drift, which is where your heart rate starts to increase gradually across time during your workouts, and or you have to simply slow down because your body cannot keep up with what it needs to cool itself or produce the energy needed or deliver the oxygen it needs to support and sustain the activity that you're trying to do. Now, this can seem really frustrating, and it is really frustrating. Trust me. I trained for races for years in Georgia, here in the US, which is in the southeast corner of it, which is known for being very hot and very humid. I'm not interested in weather wars. Trust me, I believe that those of you who live other places have your own variations of crappy weather. I'm simply saying that I get it. It is really crappy, and it is hard, and it does suck. And the biggest thing I can remind you all that heat and humidity masks fitness. So do not judge your paces or your efforts or your fitness on these hot and humid days, and recognize that heat is masking fitness, and or that's being compounded from the fatigue of your training, and that you just need to you need to trust that, and that it's not a bad thing to slow down or go easier because of this. So some of the advice I can give you guys when it comes to this, there are ways to cool yourself when it comes to training in the heat or humidity. So a lot of people will use like arm sleeves and or different types of materials that are more moisture wicking to keep themselves cool. Sometimes it seems counterintuitive to wear more layers, but people who live especially in more desert conditions, hot conditions, more dry areas, they might use clothing that reflects the sun and or covers their body, especially because of the heat and sun exposure that comes from that. But in a lot of these cooling systems, you can also put like ice packs or make them wet. And so one of the things that actually can help your body when it comes to cooling itself is kind of wiping off your sweat, especially in the humid conditions, wiping that off or using a cooling towel or cold water or wiping that so your body can dissipate some of that heat from the water that's building up on you. So I really like also, if you don't have like the cooling sleeves that you can either themselves dip in water or put ice inside of them, as I personally opt for pretty often, is you will see me always running with a bandana. I do that in general because it helps with the sweat pooling in my hair and or running from like my head and my neck down my shirt. But I will also in the summer sometimes wrap ice in those bandanas. They also sell ice bandanas or cooling things like that you can just freeze and put around your neck. So having some sort of cool water or cool ice, whether that's on your arms or like I think they might sell nowadays garments with like shirt pockets in them, or your neck or cooling or whatever that looks like that. I really, really like that personally. I will also wet my hats or run my hat in a lake or a river or creek, or if I'm running on trail, I will frequently when I'm filling up my water, I will just like kind of rinse off my body with the cool water to cool me down a little bit. Or even like in my 50 miler, it was so hot at any given point in time in the middle of that race. You can go back and watch that video. I dunked myself in every stream or creek that I came across during that middle part of the day. I think it was between miles like 20 or 30, somewhere in there. I remember it being so hot and I would just dunk myself to continuously cool myself to kind of keep that core temperature down, but also use that water to kind of cool my body down and allow it to wipe off and evaporate and release some of that heat into the air. So those are two ways that you can kind of go about doing that and allowing yourself to kind of use tools in your environment to help you either cool down your temperature and or release and dissipate more heat into the environment that your body's kind of storing in your body. But when it comes to your training, the solution are things that you guys aren't going to like, are going to be slowing down, using heart rate as a gauge and potentially having a slow down to where your heart rate is lower and easier, keeping in mind that running in the heat is a little bit more stressful on your body. So you shouldn't just say, oh, well, it's hot, so my heart rate's higher and I'm working harder, so I should just ignore it and just keep going. Use a mix of RPE, but also use the talk test and heart rate kind of as a combo together. You don't need to rely on just heart rate because you might have some drift or increases with that, but also recognize that that is a reflection potentially that your body is working harder. So if it is drastically increasing or drastically being elevated all the time, you might need to slow down in order to adjust for that. And it's not uncommon to have to run slower in the summer. Between the dew point, heat, humidity, the dew point's kind of the combo of heat and humidity. You can look that up. You can see your paces during the summer for running, especially in humid conditions or hot conditions in general, they can slow down by upwards of a minute, slower than your like normal zone 2 or easy pace that you might be running already and feeling frustrated with because it feels too easy or it's so hard to maintain that to begin with. It is not uncommon to have to slow that down even further if needed in the summer. And so first of all, slow down. I know it sucks. It's totally okay. And something that I do a lot is I will take more walk breaks as well in the summer. If I'm starting to feel overheated or I'm just feeling like so beat down from the heat and humidity in the sun, I'll just take a walk break for 20 seconds in the middle of my run and then I'll keep going. Because sometimes you just need to do that and there's nothing wrong with that. You're not losing fitness or not a real runner because you have to take a walk break. But one of the things that is important too when it comes to looking at your heart rate or your exertion level with these things, even if your heart rate's frustrating, is if you are seeing a lot of that cardiac drift that I was talking about, or your heart is spiking all the time, or it is higher, and you're feeling kind of like really run down in these runs, especially if you're a heavy sweater or a heavy salt loser, is that you might want to start bringing water on more of your runs, including your short runs, and or you might need to drink more water before or during running in order to stay adequately hydrated, because remember that blood plasma is a water component of your blood, and so you might be losing a lot more sweat and that heart rate might be increasing due to that. And so one of the things that you can do is bring water even on runs less than 60 minutes. Sometimes we don't typically bring water on runs unless they're an hour or more, but if you're running in the heat and humidity, it's not a bad thing to bring water for yourself during 30, 45, 60-minute runs, and or electrolytes for that if it's an hour or more on most of your runs, especially if you are someone who loses a lot of salt in their sweat. I personally need a little bit more salt during running, especially in the heat and humidity, than I think I realized in the past. So I definitely need to be a lot more on that. So it's not uncommon for me to put a liquid IV in a bottle and bring it with me in like an hour long run. And I definitely take a lot of salt and water with me on my very, very long runs. So plan and account for needing increased hydration, whether that's on road or trail, building that in with either, the waist belts or handhelds, and or having stops along your route where you can refill water, bringing more salt with you, water filters if you have access to streams or creek crossings or rivers if you are running on trail, and being prepared to have to fill your water more frequently, drinking more frequently, and kind of keeping that hydration up. And you can use your heart rate as kind of a sign or a symbol that is starting to drift a lot more. Now, being hydrated won't 100% change the spike in your heart rate or stop cardiac drift entirely. Sometimes it's just a normal response to training. Sometimes it can just be a response that you're doing more volume or too much too soon than your trainer prepared for. It's too much exertion for your body. That's probably another conversation for another day. But that is one thing that we can do, is start bringing hydration on runs more frequently, or dialing up our electrolyte content either during our day or during our running, especially if we are salty sweaters, other than slowing down. I know people hate that. And then really relying on a combination of like RPE and the talk test with heart rate, and not just 100% relying on heart rate, although, that's kind of good advice all of the time. But being honest with ourselves, if we're pushing too hard and having to slow down, being okay with taking more walk breaks, doing these cooling approaches to help us support us with our running. I think especially if you have access to either water or creeks, or you can stop at your home or make like an aid station for yourself or whatever it is on these long hot days, that can be really helpful. Another approach too in general is that a lot of people run in the mornings. They run in the mornings when it's cooler, or you kind of gamble there with it being more humid, but it is cooler in the morning. So some people do opt to run in the mornings, or you can run in the afternoons where it's less humid if you live in a humid place, but also it is hotter. And keep in mind, with no matter what you're doing or your approach, or if you plan to run or train through summer and the hotter months of the year, that it takes about 2 weeks to adapt. So I would highly recommend starting to run more often, early and often, more frequently, and get exposed to that, and recognize that it does take about 2 weeks to adapt. So if you are listening to this and you haven't started running yet, or you want to start running, take it easier and pull back intensity, or run a little bit slower for those 2 weeks while your body adapts. Last year, when I moved from Colorado back to the East Coast where it's humid, I had been trained with the heat in Colorado, and it was pretty hot there when I was running, but it's very, very different than when you're running in the heat and humidity. And I remember taking that first week or two just really easy, and recognizing that I felt completely terrible on every run there at first as my body adapted to that, and just doing the things that I knew worked when I lived in Georgia, ice bandanas, cooling protocols. I'll stop at gas stations to use the bathroom all the time and just dunk my face and hair, rinse off all of the time, just to keep cooling my body on these runs. Or even if you have clean water in your bottle, you can kind of squirt it on yourself to cool, whatever you need to do to support yourself. But give it about 2 weeks to adapt to that. And if you are training for a race or an event that is going to take place during a hot climate environment, I really encourage you honestly to train or adapt to that to some degree. Don't just avoid the heat if you're training to race in it. That doesn't mean just, go into it and be unsafe, because, being overheated or heat stroke can be a very real thing. Dehydration is a very real thing. But being smart about your nutrition strategies, easing into it, gradually exposing yourself to the heat, adapting to it over time, being smart about when it's maybe not the best to be out there, versus, making sure you're doing the things to support yourself and what you need to do, especially depending on the climate you live in. I know not everyone here lives in a climate that is necessarily runnable throughout the whole year. I'm not suggesting anyone go run in the middle of the day in the middle of the desert, but, there are events and things that do that, right? Bad water, and people train for that. So you just have to be smart and intelligent about the way you're approaching these things, but also give your body grace. hydrate it, cool it, understand physiologically why this is so hard on you and what you need to do, and then kind of make sure you adjust your pace and intensity in training in a way that accounts for this shift in climate that comes every single year. And recognize that the fitness that you're developing and gaining, even when it's hot and you feel like you're not gaining fitness and it feels really, really terrible, once fall comes around, we call it fast fall for a reason. It's like, oh my gosh, suddenly you can run so much faster. And all of that fitness was completely worth it, throughout that whole summer. And kind of give it the idea of like, slow is relative, easy is relative, and it's not wrong to run your runs too slow or have to take walk breaks or have to, adjust a little bit to account for the heat and humidity. You're not a bad person or a bad runner. Everyone has to do this. And if anything, it will give your body some grace and space to adapt and handle the environment and the climate and the conditions in which it's trying to train and perform against. And don't avoid it if you're trying to train in it, and take care of your body, be smart, hydrate, all of those things, but recognize that you can't change the heat and humidity, and what it's happening to your physiology with that is just going to happen. And so don't beat yourself up for having to go slow or easy. I keep reiterating that because I know so many of you, that's exactly what you do. You're like, oh my gosh, I'm terrible, I'm horrible, what the heck happened to me, I'm losing fitness. As someone who's trained for races throughout the summer, more times than I think I should have ever trained throughout the summer, especially living in the southern east corner of the US. It sucks, but you actually do adapt to it. You do get better, and you do show up and fall with so much fitness if you just simply stick with it, and or recognize that it's okay if you hate summer running and you prefer to run in the winter, which I know some of you do. Summer can be your off or down season. I know a lot of people who live in potentially Florida or like Arizona or Texas. Sometimes they flop their years, right? They run a lot more in the winter because you have a lot more mild, livable, more generic winters versus the summers. And then obviously I'm sure there's places like that in Europe, across the world. I know how a lot of international listeners. I'm just more familiar with the climates in the US here. And so keep in mind that you can also segment your years, and you can choose if you want to run a spring race or a fall race, or when your A races are going to be based off that, and kind of change up your training goals or off seasons to different times of the year. And that's also perfectly okay to do. So I hope this was helpful. I know that this is a very frustrating topic for so many people. So I wanted to kind of give you guys a quick little rundown pep talk of what's actually happening in your body, how to approach this, how to ease into it, and give yourself grace as we head into the summer running months, and remind you that fitness in the fall will be there, and it will show up, and it will always be worth it. So if you found this helpful, let me know in the comments on YouTube, and or tag me, share this if you listen to this on the go, tag my Instagram handle, rate, review, subscribe, like, all of the things. And otherwise, thank you so much for listening. I will catch you on the next one.